I am a 38-year-old woman, and if you had met me 3 years ago, you might have described me as a woman who had already lost everything. My name is Claire, and for as long as I can remember, my family's small restaurant wasn't just a business, it was the heartbeat of our lives. My parents started it before I was even born, and by the time I was old enough to see over the counter, I was pouring coffee, wiping down tables, and listening to the stories of every face that walked through the door. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was a place where people celebrated birthdays, where couples got engaged, where lonely souls found warmth in cold nights. And it was where my parents, after decades of grinding work, hoped to leave behind a legacy. By the time I was 25, it was already understood I would take it over. I didn't fight the idea. I didn't run from it like some children do. I embraced it because it wasn't just theirs, it was mine too. But one night changed everything. The fire started just after midnight. I wasn't there when it happened. I had been staying at my boyfriend's apartment across town. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing endlessly. Missed calls from my father, missed calls from neighbors, and then a text from my mother that made my blood run cold. The restaurant is gone. I drove faster than I ever had in my life, barely able to see through my tears. By the time I reached the street, smoke still curled into the night sky, thick and black. Firefighters were hosing down what was left, and the familiar sign that had hung proudly above the door was now a charred skeleton of wood. I fell to my knees on the sidewalk, gasping for air that didn't seem to come. My parents stood beside me, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. The fire had gutted everything, every recipe card, every photograph on the walls, every memory embedded in those four walls. The investigators came. They asked questions. They looked for evidence. And in the end, they labeled it an accident, faulty wiring, they said. Nothing anyone could have prevented. But something in me resisted that explanation. My father's voice echoed in my head. He'd upgraded the electrical system less than a year ago. He had been meticulous about safety. He'd even hired an inspector to double-check everything. And yet, suddenly, it was all ash. Still, I wanted to believe the official report, because the alternative that someone had done this to us was too dark to face. But the months that followed were brutal. My parents, already tired from years of hard work, grew smaller, thinner, quieter. The insurance barely covered the cost of the damage. Rebuilding wasn't possible. The restaurant was gone for good, and with it, my parents' spirit. My father died a year later. His body gave out from exhaustion, heartbreak, and maybe from carrying more grief than any man could bear. I thought the worst was behind me. I thought grief was the cruelest thing I would ever face, but I was wrong. Because 2 summers after the fire, I went to the neighborhood barbecue. It was one of those easy afternoons where the air smelled of grilled corn and burgers, where kids shrieked as they ran through sprinklers, and where everyone tried to pretend our suburban lives were simple, ordinary, unshaken by tragedy. I almost didn't go. Being around people, hearing laughter felt impossible when all I wanted to do was hide. But my mother begged me. She said, "You need to remember life goes on, Claire. You need to breathe again." So I went. And for a while, it was fine. I smiled when people greeted me, even though the smile felt foreign on my face. I accepted paper plates of food I couldn't taste, and then I found myself standing by the drinks table next to my neighbor Mark. He was a few years older than me, a man with an easy laugh and a tendency to talk too much after a couple of beers. He was rambling about something I don't even remember what until he leaned closer and lowered his voice. "You know, Claire, I'll never forget that night your restaurant burned down. God, the way the flames spread. It was almost beautiful. Just one can of gasoline and poof, gone." I froze. My cup nearly slipped from my hand. I stared at him, certain I had misheard. But the drunken grin on his face told me otherwise. My throat closed. My ears roared. He didn't seem to realize what he had just admitted, or maybe he didn't care. He chuckled to himself, shaking his head. "I didn't think it would go so fast. Guess old wood burns quick." The world tilted around me. All the air rushed out of my lungs. My hands trembled so hard I had to clutch the table to keep from collapsing. For 2 years I had believed the lie of faulty wiring. For 2 years I had grieved the loss of my family's legacy as an accident. And now, standing under fairy lights strung between oak trees with the smell of barbecue sauce in the air, I realized it had been arson. And not by a stranger, by the man who lived 3 houses down. I wanted to scream. I wanted to claw at him with my nails. But instead, I just stood there paralyzed, my heart slamming against my ribs. Because this wasn't just a drunken slip, it was the unraveling of everything I thought I knew. I don't remember how long I stood there staring at Mark. My mind blank, except for the echo of his words. He had no idea what he had just done, no idea that he had ripped open a wound I had been desperately trying to stitch closed. He laughed again, muttered something about getting another drink, and staggered off toward the grill like nothing had happened. I felt my knees buckle. I left the paper plate of food on the table untouched and walked away from the crowd. My chest ached with every breath, and I couldn't tell if I was shaking from rage, fear, or the sudden flood of grief I thought I had buried. I ended up behind the neighbor's garage, hidden from view, clutching the edge of a trash can, as tears stung my eyes. For 2 years I had accepted the accident. I had blamed fate. Now fate had a face, and it was the smug face of the man who smiled at my mother whenever he saw her in the yard. The rest of that barbecue passed in a haze. I left early, making some excuse about feeling sick, but inside I was boiling. I went home, sat on the edge of my bed, and replayed his words over and over until they blurred into one endless refrain. Just 1 can of gasoline and poof, gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept imagining my father, the way his shoulders slumped after the fire, the way he stopped joking, the way he looked older with each passing week. He died never knowing the truth that his life's work hadn't been stolen by faulty wiring but by a neighbor's cruel, calculated choice. I clenched my fists so tightly my nails dug into my palms. The next morning, I called my mother. I wanted to tell her everything. But when she answered the phone, her voice soft with sleep, I hesitated. She had been through enough. If I told her what I had learned, it might break her all over again. So I said nothing. I swallowed the truth like poison and carried it alone. But the poison spread. Every time I passed Mark's house, I felt my jaw tighten. I noticed things I hadn't before: the shiny new car in his driveway, the expensive landscaping, the smug way he carried himself. He had prospered while my family had crumbled. And I couldn't help but wonder why. Why had he done it? Was it greed? Jealousy? A business rivalry I didn't know about? Or was it simply the thrill of destruction? I couldn't stand not knowing, so I started watching him. At first casually, then obsessively. I noted when he left for work, when he came home, who visited his house. I found myself parked a block away sometimes, waiting, studying. I told myself it wasn't revenge, not yet. It was just information gathering. If I was going to confront him, I needed to know what kind of man I was dealing with. And the more I watched, the more I realized he wasn't just reckless, he was cruel. I saw him yell at his wife in the driveway, slamming his fists against the hood of his car. I heard him snap at his teenage son, calling him useless, lazy, a disappointment. He wasn't just a man who had burned down a restaurant. He was a man who thrived on control, on fear, on making others feel small. I should have gone to the police. That's what a sane person would do. But how could I? His confession hadn't been recorded. It had been slurred through beer at a neighborhood barbecue. Without evidence, it was my word against his. And he was smart enough to deny everything. So I carried the secret. And with each day, the rage inside me grew. One night, I sat on my couch with the lights off, staring at the framed photograph of my father in the restaurant kitchen. His apron was dusted with flour, his face glowing with pride. The ache in my chest became unbearable. I whispered aloud, "I will make him pay, Dad. I promise you I will." The idea of revenge took root slowly like a seed buried deep in the soil. At first I thought about small things: anonymous calls to his workplace, letters slipped into his wife's mailbox. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want to scare him. I didn't want him to simply feel uneasy. I wanted him to lose something. Something that mattered. Still, I had to be careful. Revenge isn't something you rush. It's something you plan patiently, like setting the stage for a play. One wrong move and everything collapses. So I started digging into his past. Public records, old news articles, anything I could find. What I discovered stunned me. Years ago, he had applied for a permit to open a competing restaurant not far from ours, but the city had denied it after my father submitted a counter-application. He had been bitter ever since, though he never showed it openly. And then, 2 years later, my family's restaurant just happened to burn down. My blood boiled. It wasn't random. It wasn't reckless. It was calculated revenge. Suddenly, everything made sense. The smirk at the barbecue, the new car, the ease with which he had carried on while my family sank into ruin. He had taken everything from us because he couldn't stand losing fairly. That night, as I closed my laptop, I knew one thing for certain: I was done waiting. I would not let my father's death, my family's suffering, go unanswered. Mark thought he had buried his secret in ashes. He thought time had erased his crime. But he was wrong, because I was still here, and I wasn't afraid anymore. Once I admitted to myself that I wanted revenge, there was no going back. The thought became a constant presence in my mind, whispering at me during the day, wrapping around me at night. It didn't feel like rage anymore. It felt like purpose. Like I was finally moving toward something instead of drowning in grief. I started small. I learned his routines in detail, memorized when his wife left for work, when his kids were at school, when he liked to mow the lawn or wash his car. I noted every pattern. For weeks, I didn't act, only observed. Patience, I told myself. Patience is what will make this work. But patience can be cruel. It gives you time to doubt, to second guess. Some nights, I lay awake wondering, am I turning into the very thing I hate? My father raised me to believe in fairness and justice. What would he say if he saw me scheming in the shadows? Would he be disappointed? Or would he look at me with the same tired eyes he had after the fire and nod silently, approving that at least someone was standing up for what was taken from us? I clung to the second possibility because the first would have broken me. Then one evening, I got my opportunity. I was walking past his driveway when I saw his garage door open, the inside cluttered with boxes, tools, and half-finished projects. But what caught my eye was a red canister sitting just inside, a gas can. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. I couldn't prove it was the same one he had used, but in my mind I saw it instantly: the can, the sloshing liquid, the flames devouring my family's legacy. I had to grip my car keys so tightly that they left little crescents in my palm to stop myself from marching into that garage and smashing the thing to pieces. Instead, I kept walking, my body trembling, and by the time I reached my house, I knew. The plan would no longer stay an idea in my head. The next day, I made a decision: if justice wouldn't come from the law, it would come from me. I didn't want to hurt his children. They weren't to blame. I didn't even want to ruin his wife, though I suspected she knew far more about his cruelty than she admitted. No, I wanted him alone. I wanted him exposed, stripped of the image he had built. And so I started gathering evidence. I bought a small voice recorder, something I could slip into my pocket. Every time I was near him, I tried to steer the conversation back to that night. Casual, almost friendly, as though I wanted to hear the story again. For weeks he gave me nothing, just drunken ramblings, pointless chatter. But then came the night when he got a little too drunk, when his words slurred and his guard slipped. We were standing at the edge of another gathering, this time a birthday party for a neighbor's child. He was sipping from a flask. He thought no one noticed. I laughed at something meaningless he said, then leaned in and murmured, I still can't believe the fire was really just an accident, he snorted. Loud, derisive. Accident, please. That dump was a fire hazard waiting to happen. I just sped things up a little. My skin went cold, but I kept my face neutral, nodding as if it was the most casual thing in the world. Meanwhile, my hand pressed against the recorder hidden in my pocket, my thumb steady on the button. Every word he said spilled into it, every arrogant laugh, every mocking tone. I went home that night and listened to it over and over until I could barely hear my own thoughts. I had him. Proof. But proof wasn't enough, not yet. If I handed it straight to the police, he might wriggle out of it. Claim he was joking. Claim I had doctored the recording. I needed more. I needed a way to bring his whole facade crashing down. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. His company, some mid-sized contracting firm, was hosting a community event, a kind of charity dinner to raise funds for a local cause. Everyone in the neighborhood was invited, and I knew he'd be there surrounded by people he wanted to impress. His wife, his kids, his coworkers all watching. That's when the idea hit me. If he liked to brag while drunk, why not give him the stage? Why not create the one situation where he couldn't take his words back, where the whole neighborhood would hear the truth from his own mouth? I spent the next week preparing. I copied the recording onto a small USB drive, tucked it into my purse, and prayed for the right moment. I barely slept, my nerves taut, but beneath the fear was something else: anticipation. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The night of the charity dinner, I walked into the community hall wearing a black dress that had belonged to my mother. My hands shook as I greeted people, my smile tight but convincing. And then I saw him, Mark, in a suit, laughing loudly, shaking hands, looking every bit the respectable neighbor. My stomach twisted, but I steadied myself. Tonight, that mask would fall. The speeches dragged on. The food tasted like ash in my mouth. And then came the part where people were invited to share stories about the community, memories, little jokes. My chance. When I stood up and walked to the microphone, my hands were trembling so badly I thought I might drop it. I looked out at the faces, neighbors, families, children, and then at him. His smirk faltered for just a second when he realized I was about to speak. I took a deep breath. My heart was a drumbeat in my ears. And then I said, 2 years ago, my family's restaurant burned to the ground. Most of you remember it. You brought casseroles, you sent flowers. You told us how sorry you were. And we believed it was an accident. The room grew quiet. Chairs creaked. Eyes shifted toward Mark, though no one knew why yet. I reached into my purse, pulled out the USB, and held it up. But sometimes I continued, my voice sharp with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The truth hides until the guilty decide to brag. My voice echoed through the hall, and for a split second I thought about stopping. About slipping the USB back into my purse, pretending this was nothing but a grief-stricken woman's rambling. But then I saw his face. Mark's smug little grin, the way he leaned back in his chair as though none of this mattered. That was what pushed me forward. I handed the USB to the event coordinator, who had been fumbling nervously beside me. "Please," I said softly but firmly. "Play this." He hesitated, glancing between me and Mark, but something in my eyes must have told him I wasn't asking, I was demanding. He plugged it in. The speakers crackled to life. And then Mark's voice filled the room. "Accident, please. That dump was a fire hazard waiting to happen. I just sped things up a little." The room went deathly silent. You could have heard a fork drop. Every head turned toward him. His wife's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide in shock. His son stared at him, pale, frozen. Mark's face drained of color. He stood, suddenly knocking his chair backward with a loud clatter. "That's a lie," he barked, his voice trembling. "That's doctored. You all know her. She's bitter. She's trying to ruin me." But then the recording played again. And again. His drunken laugh, that sneering tone, the words that no one could unhear. Whispers rippled through the hall. Neighbors leaned toward each other, murmuring, shaking their heads. Someone gasped. Someone else cursed under their breath. I stood at the microphone, my body shaking but my voice steady. That was the man you welcomed into your homes. That was the man who smiled at me and my mother while we stood in ashes. My father died believing it was an accident. He carried that grief to his grave. But now you know the truth. This man burned down our restaurant. He destroyed everything my family built because he couldn't stand to lose. Mark lunged toward me, his face red, his fists clenched. For a moment, I thought he might actually hit me in front of everyone. But before he could reach me, two men, neighbors, friends of my father, stepped between us. One of them shoved him back roughly. "Don't you dare," one of them growled. The tension in the room broke. People were shouting now, pointing, demanding answers. His wife stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She slapped him across the face with a crack that silenced the room for a moment, then stormed out, dragging their son with her. His daughter was crying, covering her ears. And there he stood suddenly, small, exposed, cornered. I felt no joy in that moment. No satisfaction, not yet. Only a hollow ache where my heart used to be. Because as much as I had dreamed of revenge, nothing could bring back what he had taken. Nothing could resurrect my father. Nothing could rebuild the memories lost to flames, but justice that was still possible. The police were called before I even stepped off the stage. Neighbors handed over their phones with recordings of his outburst, their statements piling up like stones around him. By the time the officers arrived, his protests had become wild, incoherent. He was dragged out of the hall, his shouts echoing in the night. I sat down in a chair in the corner, trembling from head to toe. My mother appeared beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt. I looked into her eyes, braced for anger that I hadn't told her sooner, braced for disappointment. But all she said was, "You did what your father couldn't." And for the first time in years, I let myself cry, not the quiet tears I had shed alone in the dark, but deep, racking sobs that shook me until I couldn't breathe. My mother held me, and I clung to her like a child. The weeks that followed were a blur. The evidence was enough to open a case. The recording, the testimonies, his wife's cooperation, it all came together like the pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting to be assembled. I sat in a courtroom and listened as the man who destroyed my family's legacy was finally stripped bare, his lies exposed under oath. He tried to spin stories, tried to paint himself as a victim of obsession, but the truth was undeniable. Too many people had heard the recording. Too many had seen his reaction when confronted. His own wife testified against him, her voice steady as she admitted she had suspected something for years, but never had the courage to face it. The verdict was guilty. Arson, fraud, destruction of property. He was sentenced to years in prison. When the gavel came down, I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I just sat there numb, as though my body hadn't yet caught up with reality. My mother squeezed my hand again, whispering, "It's over, Claire. It's finally over." But was it? Because late at night, when the house is quiet, I still hear the crackle of flames in my dreams. I still see my father's tired face. And though Mark is gone, locked away where he belongs, the scars remain. Revenge gave me justice, but it didn't give me peace. Still, sometimes when I walk past the empty lot where the restaurant once stood, I imagine my father beside me. And for just a moment, I think I see him smile. Not because the pain is gone, but because I didn't let the truth die in silence. Because I stood up when no one else could. And maybe that's enough. The trial may have ended with a guilty verdict, but life after justice is not as clean as people think. For months, I would wake up expecting to see another summons, another appeal, another way for him to slip free. I had lived in the shadow of that fire for so long that part of me couldn't believe it was truly over. But it was. Mark was in prison. His family had moved away shortly after, their house standing empty and hollow on our street like a broken tooth. Neighbors who once invited him to barbecues now crossed the street at the sight of his abandoned lawn. His name was no longer spoken in friendly tones, but whispered like a curse. And yet for all that, I still felt a strange emptiness. Justice is a strange thing. It fills you for a moment, but then leaves you staring at the hole grief carved out, realizing it's still there. I tried to rebuild. My mother and I spent more time together. Sometimes we sat at her kitchen table drinking coffee, just talking, sometimes in silence. Other times we walked past the vacant lot where the restaurant had been. The city had cleared the debris long ago, but to me, the air still smelled faintly of smoke. I told her one day I wanted to rebuild, not the restaurant exactly, but something new. Something in honor of my father. She nodded, her eyes soft, and said, "When you're ready." Healing wasn't a straight line. Some days I felt stronger. Other days, grief sucker punched me all over again. One morning, I broke down simply because I found an old menu tucked into a box of photographs. Another night, I smiled through tears while remembering my father teaching me how to flip pancakes without breaking them. And then came the moment I didn't expect. Months after the trial, I was leaving the grocery store when someone tapped my shoulder. I turned, and there stood Mark's son, taller now, his face lean, older than the boy I remembered. His eyes were filled with something I couldn't read, shame, sorrow, maybe both. "Miss Claire?" he said quietly. His voice cracked. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." I didn't know what to say. This boy, no. This young man hadn't set the fire. He hadn't destroyed my father's legacy. But he had lived in the shadow of the man who did, and I could see the weight of it in his shoulders. I put a hand on his arm and whispered, "You don't have to carry your father's sins." Tears welled in his eyes. He nodded, swallowed hard, and walked away. I stood there in the parking lot, groceries forgotten, my heart aching in a new way. Because revenge had punished the guilty, but forgiveness, that was what set the innocent free. That night, I dreamed of my father again. But this time, he wasn't weary. He was behind the counter of the restaurant, laughing, flipping pancakes, calling out to customers. I woke up with tears on my pillow, but also with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The truth is, revenge gave me power when I felt powerless. Justice gave me closure when lies had tried to bury the truth. But healing, that came slowly in unexpected places. In conversations with my mother. In the apology of a son who carried his father's shadow. In the quiet realization that the fire had destroyed wood and stone, but not memory, not love. Now when I stand at the empty lot, I no longer see only ashes. I see possibility. Maybe one day I'll rebuild. Maybe I'll open a new cafe, one that carries my father's name, where people can once again gather, laugh, and find warmth. Or maybe I'll simply plant a garden there, a place of life where destruction once reigned. Either way, it will be ours again, not his. I am a 38-year-old woman who lost everything and learned that grief can twist into rage, that rage can burn as hot as fire. But I also learned something else, that truth once spoken is stronger than any flame. And though the scars remain, I am not defined by what was taken from me. I am defined by what I choose to build after. So if you're listening to this story, if you've ever felt the sting of betrayal, if you've ever thought justice would never come, hear me. Now the truth has a way of rising. It may take time. It may take courage. You don't think you have. But when you find it, when you speak it, your voice can burn brighter than any fire. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. If my story touched you, if it reminded you of your own strength in the face of loss, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe so we can continue exploring stories of resilience together. And most of all, leave a comment. Tell me your story, because sometimes the simple act of speaking the truth is the beginning of healing.